So, on paper, THCA flower in Virginia looks straightforward. It fits within hemp definitions, it's sold openly, and it's often treated as lawful. But here's the problem, that legality doesn't actually come from a single, settled rule. It comes from interpretation. And when interpretation changes, enforcement can change overnight, even if the statute never does. Here's the counterintuitive legal fact or misconception. Most people assume that if the General Assembly doesn't pass a new law, then nothing legally changes. That assumption feels reasonable, but in Virginia cannabis law, it's often wrong. What actually shifts outcomes is not always legislation. It's how agencies interpret statutes, how prosecutors frame cases, and how enforcement standards evolve quietly over time. Let's challenge a belief we most likely hold. There's a common belief that legality is binary. Something is either legal or illegal. But in Virginia, THCA sits in a conditional space, lawful under one interpretation, risky under another. And that means compliance today does not guarantee protection tomorrow. Now, before we go any further, let me be clear about what this video is and is not. This is not about encouraging use, sales, or workarounds. It's not about chemistry tricks or avoiding enforcement. This is a legal analysis, focused on how interpretation and enforcement operate in Virginia, and why THCA's status is more fragile than most people realize. Welcome to Norfolk, Virginia Cannabis Hub, where we focus on Virginia-specific cannabis law, local governance, and regulatory clarity, so residents, business owners, and communities understand what the law actually says, not just what headlines suggest. Here's the context. To understand why interpretation matters so much, we have to step back. Virginia's cannabis and hemp laws didn't evolve cleanly. They developed in layers, first federal hemp definitions, then state adoption, then later cannabis reforms that didn't fully reconcile the two systems. That layering created gaps. And THCA exists squarely inside one of those gaps. Hemp law focuses on delta-9 THC concentration. Cannabis law focuses on intoxicating effects and marijuana classification. Those frameworks don't line up neatly. So enforcement depends on which framework is emphasized, chemistry thresholds, or functional intoxication. That's why confusion is common. The law wasn't designed with THCA flower in mind. It emerged later, filling a space the statutes never clearly addressed. Here's the legal explanation. Under current Virginia law, hemp is defined using delta-9 THC concentration thresholds. THCA, in its raw form, does not meet that threshold. On labeling and lab reports, that matters, but, and this is critical, lab reports are not statutes. They're evidence. Virginia law allows prosecutors and courts to look beyond labels and into effects, intent, and use. More accurately, the law does not prohibit that analysis. And when statutes are silent, interpretation fills the space. This is where interpretation becomes everything. One reading treats THCA flower as compliant hemp. Another treats it as cannabis based on its conversion potential and use context. Neither interpretation requires a new law to exist. How enforcement works. Enforcement does not begin with a statute book. It begins with a situation, a complaint, a stop, a report, an inspection. Law enforcement does not enforce chemistry in isolation. They enforce behavior, possession, and context. Investigations may involve lab testing, but lab testing is not determinative by itself. Prosecutors decide how evidence is framed. Courts decide how standards are applied. And those decisions can shift without legislative action. This is why enforcement discretion matters more than people think. A change in prosecutorial policy, or even informal guidance, can alter outcomes statewide, quietly. Who this affects. So let's slow this down and talk about who this actually affects, because this isn't theoretical. For consumers, interpretation changes create real legal uncertainty. A product that was purchased openly, taxed, and marketed as lawful hemp doesn't suddenly disappear just because enforcement priorities shift. But the treatment of that product can change. That means someone acting in good faith today could be judged under a different standard tomorrow, without ever being told the rules changed. For retailers, this is even more serious. Many businesses rely heavily on labeling, certificates of analysis, and supplier assurances. And under normal regulatory systems, that reliance would make sense. But when enforcement standards evolve, labels stop being shields and start being just one piece of evidence. Retailers can find themselves exposed even when they believed they were fully compliant. For local governments, interpretation changes ripple outward. Zoning enforcement, nuisance complaints, and local ordinances often follow state enforcement signals. If interpretation tightens, localities may feel pressure to respond, even if no new law exists. That can mean sudden shifts in how businesses are treated at the city or county level. Why this matters. Now, let's talk about why all of this matters beyond individual cases. First, it matters for public safety. When enforcement is inconsistent or unpredictable, trust erodes. People don't know what standards apply, and that uncertainty doesn't promote responsible behavior, it creates confusion. Second, it matters for regulatory clarity. Businesses and residents rely on predictability to make decisions. When legality depends on interpretation rather than clear rules, compliance becomes guesswork instead of guidance. Third, it matters legally and financially. Enforcement risk doesn't require wrongdoing. It doesn't require intent. Sometimes, it only requires reinterpretation. That means legal exposure can exist even when someone believes they're following the rules exactly as written. And long-term, it matters for policy development. When gray areas persist, enforcement fills the vacuum. Instead of lawmakers clarifying the law, outcomes get shaped case by case, quietly, unevenly, and without public input. Why most people misunderstand the risk. Now, this is where most people misunderstand the situation. They focus on whether THCA is legal today. And that's the wrong question. The real risk isn't today. The real risk is what happens when interpretation shifts tomorrow, without warning, without legislation, and without public debate. Because when interpretation changes, enforcement can follow immediately. There's no grace period. No public notice. No headline announcing the shift. Here's a scenario. So let's return to the scenario I mentioned earlier, because this is where it really clicks. Imagine two identical situations, same product, same lab report, same possession. In one jurisdiction, enforcement treats the product as compliant hemp. No issue. No charges. No consequences. In another jurisdiction, prosecutors argue functional equivalence to marijuana, based on effects, use context, or broader interpretation. Suddenly, the outcome changes. Nothing about the product changed, nothing about the lab report changed, nothing about the person changed. The only thing that changed was the interpretation applied to it. That's not hypothetical. That's how gray area enforcement works. And that, right there, is the legal reality of THCA in Virginia today. Here's what to watch next. And this leads directly to the next question, not whether interpretation can change, but how enforcement actually works in real situations across Virginia. Because once you understand enforcement mechanics, you start to see where the real pressure points are. So here's the question I want you thinking about. If legality depends on interpretation, not just statutes, what protections actually exist when enforcement standards shift? Drop your questions in the comments. Let me know what you want explored next. If you're looking for deeper, Virginia-specific analysis, join the Norfolk City Cannabis Community. And if this kind of compliance-focused breakdown is helpful, like, comment, and subscribe, because this issue isn't settled, and the next video dives straight into enforcement realities on the ground.